Factory accidents crushed and blinded thousands of kids. Imagine a child barely taller than the machine he's cleaning, his fingers trembling, his shirt damp with sweat, and the roar of factory gears surrounding him like a cage of iron teeth. That was not a nightmare, but the daily reality for thousands of children in Edwardian Britain. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, factories didn't just use child labor, they depended on it. Children were not a backup workforce. They were the hidden cogs in the industrial machine. And when those cogs jammed, when little hands were caught or bones crushed, the machines kept moving. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into a manufacturing powerhouse. But beneath the surface of its wealth was a hidden cost, one paid by the smallest and weakest. In cotton mills, textile factories, matchstick plants, and metalworks, children as young as 6 were hired to clean, to fetch, to reach into spaces too tight for adult hands. Factory owners valued them not because they were efficient, but because they were small, cheap, and replaceable. The machines never stopped. Driven by profit, mills ran 12 to 16 hours a day, often 6 days a week. The looms, presses, gears, and rollers were never turned off, not even for cleaning. Instead, children were told to crawl under and between the mechanisms while they still moved. Their little hands had to dart in and out of belts and flywheels, wiping down grease or retrieving a dropped spool. One blink too long, one twitch of the machine, and the child's hand would be caught, twisted, crushed, or worse. Reports from the era speak of boys who lost fingers and returned to work the next day with bandaged stumps, of girls whose scalps were torn away when their hair got caught in belts, of a 10-year-old boy who lost both arms to a mangle machine while trying to clean its underside. And then there were the eyes, blinded by flying bits of metal, dust, chemicals, or boiling steam. Many children didn't survive at all. They bled out on factory floors or were dumped at hospital doors, nameless and discarded like broken tools. Inspectors eventually began documenting these horrors, but even their reports were couched in cold language. Accident due to carelessness, they would write. Injury sustained while operating belt pulley. But what those words concealed were the screams, the panic, the disfigurement of a child who would never hold a pencil again. And in most cases, the factory paid no compensation. The families were told to be grateful the child had a job in the first place. Some of the worst conditions were in the cotton mills of Lancashire. Here, children were made to scavenge beneath machines while they ran. This involved crawling into spaces so tight they had to lie flat as gears spun inches above their faces. If they moved too slowly, the machine crushed their arms or sliced into their backs. The risk was constant. And yet, supervisors shouted at them to move faster. Efficiency mattered more than safety. Why didn't their parents stop it? The answer lies in poverty. Entire families lived off the combined income of every member, children included. Refusing a factory job meant starvation. And in overcrowded slums with 5 or more siblings packed into one room, there was no room for dreams, only survival. Even school attendance laws were barely enforced, and many factory owners bribed inspectors or forged paperwork. Children were told they'd be apprenticed, but what they got was servitude. Then came the dangerous chemicals. In matchstick factories, children handled white phosphorus, deadly to touch, poisonous to inhale. It caused phossy jaw, a grotesque condition where the bones of the jaw would decay from within, leaving holes in the face and a slow, painful death. In other places, acids used to clean metals caused skin burns and blindness. Protective gear was almost non-existent. A rag for your mouth, a cap for your hair. That was it. Some children never even got that. Orphans, street children, and workhouse inmates were often sent to the most dangerous tasks, treated as utterly disposable. They were assigned to night shifts with less supervision, no breaks, and even less safety. Some factories bribed local poorhouses to loan them children. And when those children were maimed, the paperwork vanished, and another nameless boy took his place. By the early 20th century, public outrage slowly began to swell. Newspapers began publishing illustrations of maimed children. Journalists snuck into factories to photograph young workers with missing limbs. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury and Florence Kelley raised their voices, demanding age limits and safety laws. But for every rule passed, there was a loophole exploited. For every factory inspected, a dozen more continued in the shadows. It wasn't until the 1901 Factory and Workshop Act that real change began. This law set minimum working ages and required part-time schooling. But enforcement remained weak. Many employers simply lied about ages, or they shifted the most dangerous jobs into informal roles not covered by the Act. Children still worked. Children still died. It would take decades more of legislation, labor movements, and civil pressure to dismantle this hidden system of abuse. But by then, the damage was done. A generation of working-class children bore the scars, literally. Some lived with hooks instead of hands. Some never grew properly due to years of malnutrition and strain. And many carried psychological wounds, having witnessed death and cruelty before they were even old enough to read. This is not just the story of the past. It's the story of what happens when profit overrides humanity, when a society decides that certain lives are expendable as long as the gears keep turning. Edwardian factories did not just build cloth and steel, they built a legacy of pain, a quiet genocide of innocence. And every crushed finger, every blinded eye, every silent scream buried beneath the clatter of machines, that was a child who mattered. A child who should have been in a classroom, not under a piston. A child who should have been safe. But in the factory age, safety had a price, and the children paid it in pieces. Orphan trains deported thousands of poor children. Imagine you're 7 years old. The streets of East London are all you've ever known. You don't have a bed, just a corner in a cold alley. Your mother vanished 2 winters ago. Your father died in the workhouse. You're alone, until one morning, a stranger offers you clothes, bread, and a train ticket. You're told you're going somewhere warm, somewhere better, where families are waiting to love you. But you don't realize this is not a journey of hope. It's exile. This is the true and haunting story of how thousands of Britain's poorest children were deported overseas, not as refugees, not as adoptees, but as human exports in a system that masked abandonment as salvation. Between the 1860s and as late as 1970, more than 100,000 children from Britain were forcibly sent to countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and what was then Southern Rhodesia. The British government called it child migration. They said it was a solution to urban poverty, to overfilled orphanages and workhouses. But this wasn't charity. This was social cleansing. The empire didn't want its cities overrun with poor, neglected children. It wanted them gone, out of sight, out of mind, thousands of miles away. The children sent were often told they were orphans, but that wasn't always true. Many had living parents who, due to poverty, were unable to care for them temporarily. Instead of being reunited, these children were permanently severed from their families. Social workers forged documents. Consent was bypassed, and once a child boarded the ship, they vanished from Britain's ledgers as if they never existed. Upon arrival in Canada or Australia, these children were rarely greeted with warmth. They were not adopted into loving families. They were distributed, assigned to farms, factories, or institutional homes. Boys were expected to labor in fields or mines. Girls were sent into domestic service. Promises of education and safety evaporated. Instead, children found themselves living in barns, working from dawn until night, often beaten, starved, or abused by the very people who claimed to be their guardians. And if they complained, if they dared speak up, there was no one to protect them. Many were in isolated rural areas, hours from the nearest town. Letters home were censored or never sent, and most didn't know where home even was. They had been told that their mothers were dead, their fathers criminals, their siblings untraceable. This was not only physical exile, it was the erasure of identity. In Australia, many ended up in church-run institutions that would later be exposed for systemic abuse, both physical and sexual. In Canada, child labor laws were flouted, and entire communities viewed these British children as second class, cheap laborers, not citizens. They were mocked for their accents. They were ostracized in schools. They were, in every way, treated as expendable. Yet the scheme continued, decade after decade. Even after World War II, when the horrors of human displacement were fresh in the world's mind, Britain kept sending its children away. Under newer names like Fairbridge Society or Child Welfare Migration, the practice continued into the 1960s and beyond. Many of the institutions receiving these children were publicly praised by the British elite, including royalty. But behind closed doors, these places were often brutal, secretive, and utterly indifferent to the well-being of the children they housed. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that the silence began to break. Survivors, now adults, began to speak. They told of being raped, of being locked in cellars, of being forced to scrub floors until their knees bled. They described the loneliness that clung to them for decades, the nightmares, the lifelong search for a name, a photo, a single document that could explain why they were discarded like refuse. Public apologies came slowly. In 2010, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official statement of regret, calling it a stain on our nation's conscience. Australia, too, held national apologies. But for most survivors, the damage was already permanent. Families had been lost, childhoods erased, and for many, the truth came too late. What makes this history so chilling is that it was presented to the public as kindness. The language was always warm: rescue, opportunity, better life. But the reality was institutional abandonment, state-sponsored trauma, and the systemic devaluation of poor children's lives. Britain didn't want to fix its child poverty. It wanted to export it. And the echoes of this past still linger. Some survivors have spent their entire lives trying to track down their birth families. Some never found them. Others died without ever understanding why their government sent them away. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning about what happens when bureaucracy and morality become strangers. When a nation decides that erasing its poor is more convenient than helping them. When empathy is replaced by expedience, and children become paperwork to be processed, relocated, forgotten. So next time someone tells you about the glory of the British Empire, remember the children it shipped across oceans without consent, without love, and without return. Remember that even in the most civilized societies, cruelty can be dressed as policy, and betrayal can come with a signature and a seal. And remember that those children weren't numbers, they were lives, and too many of them ended not in hope, but in silence, alone. Chimney sweeps often died inside the flues. They were small enough to fit inside the walls of a home. That's all that mattered. In 18th and 19th century Britain, as cities expanded and chimneys multiplied across rooftops like veins in a body gasping for warmth, a new class of worker emerged. Children, often boys as young as 4 or 5, chosen for their size. They weren't given tools or even safety ropes. They were the tools. Sent up into narrow, pitch-black flues, their bare elbows and knees scraped brick as they climbed towards soot-clogged crevices. Sometimes the width of the chimney was no more than 9 inches. But they were expected to squeeze through, twisting, coughing, clawing upward in total darkness. The work was called sweeping, but the word is cruelly misleading. There was no elegance in it. These children crawled inside living structures that functioned like death traps. The flues twisted like intestines, and any hesitation, a wrong bend, a shallow breath, could result in suffocation. Soot rained into their eyes, filled their lungs, and coated their throats. If a boy panicked halfway up, his cries would be muffled by the brick. If he got stuck, there was no rescue. Sometimes chimney walls bore scars from past tragedies, claw marks in the mortar where a child had tried to dig their way out. The master sweeps, often former chimney boys themselves, justified it as tradition. They'd wake the children before dawn, feed them scraps, and march them into strangers' homes. Naked or near naked, to prevent soot buildup in clothing, the children were pushed toward the hearth with only a brush, a scraper, and their instincts. The masters told them to chant, "Here I come," as they climbed, so the living above wouldn't be startled by sudden ash eruptions. But the chant also served another purpose. If the boy's voice stopped, it was a warning. Even the laws meant to protect them were weak or ignored. Lord Shaftesbury's Acts tried to restrict the use of child labor in chimneys, but enforcement was rare. Many households claimed not to know a child was in their flue. The children were unseen, unheard, tucked inside the architecture of polite society. The wealthy kept their parlors clean and their guests warm, while a soot-covered orphan suffocated silently inside the wall. Many of these boys never lived to adulthood. They died from falls, sometimes plunging 2 or 3 stories down onto stone grates. They died from being wedged inside, slowly asphyxiating as ash filled their lungs and panic overrode reason. And others died from something crueler: time. The long-term exposure to coal dust and soot caused a rare form of cancer, scrotal cancer, found almost exclusively in chimney sweeps. Doctors in the 18th century first noticed it, but it took decades for society to connect the dots. These children weren't just laborers. They were canaries in coal-black chimneys, sacrificed to industrial fire for the sake of warmth and profit. Even their nicknames revealed society's cold indifference. They were called climbing boys, as if it were a sport. But there was no joy in their ascent, no triumph, only the constant threat of death above and punishment below. Those who hesitated to climb were beaten. Some were burned, masters lighting small fires to force them upward with smoke. Others were tied to chimney brushes and hoisted like bait, their bodies used to clean sharp brick that shredded skin with every tug. Some survivors spoke years later, broken men whose lungs wheezed with every breath, their skin permanently stained, their posture twisted. They had seen friends vanish into flues and never return. They had nightmares of being bricked in alive. Some described hearing scratching inside chimneys at night long after the job was done, convinced that the ghosts of boys who never made it out still tried to claw their way into the air. The industrial age turned soot into wealth, but that wealth was built on the backs and inside the bones of children. There was no heroism in their labor, only necessity enforced by poverty and sanctioned by indifference. Workhouses offered no escape. If you were an orphan or a poor child, you belonged to someone. And that someone might sell your body, not for pleasure, not for war, but to disappear into the walls of a stranger's home and clean the fire they never saw. This is why the story matters now, not just because of the cruelty, but because of the silence. Chimney sweeps were among the most invisible laborers in history. They lived inside structures designed to hide them. Their deaths were quiet, their suffering trapped inside ventilation systems that breathed for others while choking them. Society looked up at clean chimneys and saw progress. But they never looked in. Even today, remnants of this system linger. Some old chimneys, when opened during restoration, reveal bones, tiny, fragile remains of boys who went up and never came down. These children are not statistics. They were living, breathing human beings with dreams and fears, crushed under the weight of soot, stone, and social blindness. Their legacy isn't one of invention or rebellion. It is a lesson in what happens when empathy is filtered out of architecture. When comfort for the many is built on the sacrifice of the voiceless few. They were not martyrs. They were stolen childhoods. Their ashes were not scattered. They were scrubbed away, denied names, forgotten in the crevices of empire. But now we remember them, not to pity, not to mourn in passing, but to confront a truth too often ignored, that even bricks can bleed history, and sometimes the cost of warmth is written in the soot beneath our feet. Ragpickers risk disease. Digging through rotting trash. Imagine a world where a child's job was to wake up before dawn, not to attend school or play with friends, but to dig through mountains of rotting garbage. Not for adventure, not for curiosity, but for survival. In the industrial cities of the 19th and early 20th centuries, children known as ragpickers were a common, tragic sight. These were not thieves or misfits, but victims of a brutal economic reality. With bare hands and threadbare clothing, they scoured the trash heaps of society, looking for bones, cloth, metal, or anything that could be exchanged for a penny. And in doing so, they exposed themselves daily to rats, filth, infections, and slow, agonizing deaths. In places like London, New York, and Paris, the explosion of industry came with an avalanche of waste. Household trash was dumped in alleys, streets, or municipal tips, open, festering piles of rotting food, broken glass, rusted nails, and dead animals. Municipal sanitation was primitive or non-existent. These piles became both workplace and danger zone for the ragpicker child. They'd carry sacks almost as big as their bodies, poking through foul-smelling refuse with sticks, sometimes crawling on all fours through heaps slick with grease and rot. The term ragpicker might sound almost quaint, but it masked a daily horror. What these children picked was not just rags. Bones were valuable to glue makers. Scrap metal could fetch a few coins. Cloth and paper could be sold by the weight. Some children even collected cigarette butts to unravel and resell as cheap tobacco. But every item retrieved carried a hidden price: bacterial infections from meat that had spoiled in the sun, sharp wounds from hidden nails, or fevers caught from lice-infested clothing. Without shoes, gloves, or masks, their young bodies were exposed to every contaminant imaginable. Cuts led to tetanus or sepsis. Rat bites led to festering sores. Many children developed chronic respiratory diseases from inhaling decaying matter day after day. They worked not for some long-term gain or education, but for survival. A good haul might earn them enough to buy bread or soup. A bad day meant hunger. Some returned home with coins, others returned with infections. For some, the end came quickly: gangrene, tuberculosis, pneumonia. For others, it came slowly, wearing them down, bone by bone. Many didn't survive childhood. Those who did often emerged with damaged lungs, broken limbs, and no education. In Paris, they were known as chiffoniers and were part of a long-established caste of urban scavengers, sometimes tolerated by the authorities, sometimes harassed. They developed their own subculture, a map of the best rubbish spots, the highest-paying buyers, and the trick to digging through garbage without being caught by police or bitten by rats. In London, they often worked near the Thames, where refuse washed ashore with each tide. In New York, they roamed the alleys behind factories, butcher shops, and tenements, digging through barrels and ash pits for anything remotely useful. They didn't choose this life. Many were orphans or had parents too ill or broken to work. Some were born into families where the father had died in a factory accident or disappeared into prison, leaving the mother with too many mouths to feed. In such households, a child's labor was not optional. It was vital. Some ragpickers were as young as 5. Others lied about their age just to appear older and more capable. They worked in all seasons, in rain, snow, and blistering summer heat. Their tiny bodies navigated the same trash that rats and stray dogs crawled through. Some slept in the same alleys where they worked, curled up beside their sacks, wrapped in salvaged rags that still stank of other people's decay. Occasionally, a reformer or journalist would publish a shocking exposé, a photo of a ragpicker child knee-deep in refuse, or a headline screaming about child scavengers. Laws were proposed, speeches were made, but in most places, little changed. Ragpickers were hard to regulate because they existed in the shadows. They weren't on payrolls or factory rosters. They were self-employed in the cruelest sense, working only as long as their bodies could endure, with no safety net if they fell ill or disappeared. Even worse, the authorities often blamed them for the very filth they were forced to endure. Newspapers labeled them gutter kids, accusing them of spreading disease rather than acknowledging they were its first victims. Police sometimes arrested them for loitering or theft, ignoring the fact that their only crime was poverty. In some cities, reformers tried to establish schools or trade programs for ragpickers, but most efforts were underfunded and overwhelmed. The industrial machine kept turning, and the garbage kept piling up. Behind the tragedy was a kind of haunting dignity. These children weren't criminals or degenerates. They were survivors. They developed an astonishing resilience, learning to spot value in decay, to avoid danger with instinct, to share scraps of food with each other, to hide from patrols, and to navigate a world that didn't care if they lived or died. They were children forced to carry adult burdens, aging before their time, moving through life in a constant state of exhaustion and exposure. They left behind little in the way of records, no letters, no memoirs, no monuments. But their existence formed a hidden foundation of industrial society. The factories and shops they scavenged behind ran smoother because someone was clearing away their waste. The glue used to bind books, the rags used to clean machines, the scraps melted down into new tools. Much of it came from the hands of children the world refused to see. Their story is not some distant horror. It is a mirror, reflecting the cost of ignoring poverty, the danger of letting children become economic tools, the risk of believing that some lives matter less than others. Today, child labor still exists in many corners of the world. Different clothes, different names, but the same hunger, the same desperation. The Ragpickers are gone from our streets, but not from history. They deserve more than a footnote. They deserve remembrance, not just for what they endured, but for what their suffering says about us, about what we build, and what we're willing to overlook to keep our cities clean. Child beggars were often maimed on purpose. Imagine you're walking through a crowded, noisy street in a 19th century city. The air stinks of smoke, sweat, and sewage. Horse carts rattle by, street vendors shout, and somewhere near your feet, a child, barely able to stand, reaches up with twisted fingers and hollow eyes, begging for a single coin. You think, what misfortune put them here? But what if it wasn't misfortune? What if that child's suffering was intentional? This is one of the darkest corners of urban history. In the slums of cities like London, Paris, and later New York, there existed a quiet, hidden system of cruelty, the deliberate maiming of children by criminal gangs to make them more profitable beggars. These were not myths or exaggerations. They were exposed in court records, police files, and first-hand testimonies, stories so horrific they barely seemed real. The logic was brutal. A healthy child might earn sympathy, but a child with missing limbs, burned skin, deformed bones? That child drew more attention, more pity, more money. And so, in the shadows of the alleyways and underworld dens, gangs turned children into tools, breaking their arms, burning their faces, even blinding them, so they would elicit greater charity on the streets. It wasn't just exploitation. It was manufactured misery. This practice wasn't new. It had roots in older traditions. In some parts of medieval Europe and Asia, beggar guilds were known to disfigure members to increase earnings. But during the industrial era, when city populations exploded and poverty became a visible daily crisis, the manipulation of child suffering reached industrial scale. Cities had become breeding grounds for exploitation, anonymous, crowded, and full of desperate eyes that people learned to ignore. Many of these children were orphans, stolen from poor families, or sold under false promises of care. Once taken, they were passed through networks that trained them not in schoolrooms, but in survival. How to elicit sympathy, how to fake cries, how to avoid the police. But for some, even acting wasn't needed. The damage done to their bodies was real and irreversible. In 1850s London, authorities uncovered a ring of beggar masters who kept children locked in cellars, only allowing them out during the day to beg. Some had healed over fractures, others had burn scars that told silent stories. In Paris, journalists documented cases where children's eyes had been deliberately damaged with acid. And in the Ottoman Empire, travelers wrote of beggars whose limbs appeared too perfectly deformed to be accidental. Whispers passed through markets and taverns. Don't trust the wounds you see. They may have been placed there on purpose. Charles Dickens hinted at this horror in his works, especially in Oliver Twist, where the character of Fagin trains children for street crime. But even he, with all his grim realism, stopped short of the full truth. What truly happened in those slums was often too monstrous for fiction, because the harm wasn't a side effect. It was the business model. Reports from social workers in the early 20th century, especially in Eastern Europe and parts of India, echoed the same pattern. Children disfigured, trained, then deployed into the streets like merchandise. Some were rotated between cities to avoid detection. Others were punished, beaten, or starved if they failed to meet daily quotas. These weren't just crimes, they were systems. And they operated in plain sight. Officials often looked away. Corruption ran deep. Police were bribed. Judges were indifferent. Society, overwhelmed by poverty and inequality, found it easier to blame the beggars than to confront those who profited from them. Occasionally, someone spoke up. Reformers, missionaries, and rogue inspectors exposed scandals, raided beggar rings, and lobbied for child protection laws. In Britain, the 1868 Poor Law Board inquiry shocked Parliament by revealing the extent of child exploitation. In France, reformers pushed for orphanage funding and child labor bans. But progress was slow. The damage had already been done to thousands, many who never lived past their teens. The psychological trauma was as deep as the physical wounds. These children often grew up without language, family, or any sense of safety. Some couldn't even remember a time before the pain. Their identities were formed inside cages of abuse. For them, freedom wasn't just about leaving the street. It was about rebuilding a self that had been shattered since infancy. And yet, as horrific as this sounds, echoes still remain today. Around the world, in parts of South Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, stories continue to surface of children mutilated and forced to beg. In some cities, beggars with strangely identical injuries raise old suspicions. NGOs have rescued children who show signs of deliberate harm. And just like before, criminal networks hide behind layers of silence, poverty, and fear. Technology has changed. The world has changed, but the old logic persists. Suffering sells. And where empathy can be monetized, monsters will find a way to profit. So next time you pass a beggar child on the street, pause, not to judge, not to assume, but to remember, some scars are real. Some were inflicted by the very hands that should have offered protection. And some children were never given a choice, not in where they live, not in what they wear, not even in what their bodies became. Their pain was made into a product, and their innocence sold for coins. School couldn't save you from starvation. Picture a child in a frost-bitten Edwardian classroom, thin fingers barely holding a pencil, stomach aching with hunger, lips chapped and blue from the cold. The teacher's voice drones on, but he hears nothing. His head is heavy, his vision blurs, and all he can think of is the faint smell of bread drifting in from the street below. For thousands of poor children across early 20th century Britain, school wasn't a refuge from poverty. It was a cold waiting room where hunger sat beside them day after day. During the Edwardian era, Britain's schools were undergoing reform. Compulsory education laws had been introduced, and by the early 1900s, attending school was no longer optional for working-class children. On the surface, this seemed like progress. But law does not fill an empty stomach. Attendance meant little when a child had eaten nothing since the day before, or perhaps not even then. The idea that schooling alone could lift a child from poverty was a comforting illusion for the middle classes. For the poor, it was a cruel contradiction. Children came to school in patched clothes and broken boots. In winter, many arrived soaked from walking through snow and rain, only to sit for hours in unheated classrooms with damp coats steaming around them. Some fainted before midday. Teachers reported children collapsing, falling asleep mid-lesson, or quietly crying from the pain of hunger. These were not exceptions. These were patterns. In industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, this was the daily rhythm of a working-class education. Arrive, freeze, hunger, repeat. In some schools, pupils were caught stealing chalk to chew on just to keep their mouths occupied. Others smuggled out coal from classroom fireplaces to trade for scraps of food. And it wasn't always done in secret. Teachers knew. They saw children fight over the heel of a loaf or arrive with bruises from scuffles at the bakery queue. But they, too, were under pressure. Education inspectors prioritized attendance and test scores, not nourishment. A child had to be present, even if they were starving, shivering, or dying inside. Even well-meaning schoolmasters were bound by system and policy. If a child missed class due to illness from hunger, parents were fined. Poor families were punished for symptoms of their poverty. For a struggling household, that might mean choosing between paying a fine or eating. Sometimes children were sent to school not to learn, but to be warm for a few hours, to sit near a fire they didn't have at home. But not all schools even had heating. In many rural villages, windows were broken, and the only source of warmth was a child's own body heat, fading fast with every passing hour. Government assistance was rare and humiliating. Charity programs, like the provision of free school meals, were fiercely debated. Some argued they encouraged dependency. Others claimed it was the responsibility of parents, not the state. So the burden fell on local councils and small charities who could only feed a few, while many went hungry. It wasn't until 1906 that the Education Provision of Meals Act was passed, allowing schools to offer meals to needy children. But even then, it was optional and limited. Many schools didn't have the resources or simply refused. And what were these meals? A weak broth, a crust of bread, perhaps tea with a splash of milk. For a child who hadn't eaten since the previous morning, it was salvation. But it wasn't enough. The calories couldn't sustain the energy needed to focus, to write, to play. Malnutrition stunted growth, dulled minds, and made children more prone to disease. Tuberculosis, rickets, and infections swept through classrooms, fueled by weakened bodies and crowded rooms. What makes this tragedy worse is the silence around it. The grand narratives of the Edwardian age speak of reform, progress, and modernity. But the suffering of these children was often erased, dismissed as a necessary hardship. Politicians and reformers praised the expanding school system, but rarely visited the tenements from which these children came. They didn't see the 5-year-old digging through ash bins for potato peels or the girl who pawned her coat to buy bread, then shivered through lessons in a borrowed scarf. Some children ran away from school, not because they hated learning, but because the streets offered a better chance at survival. A job at a bakery might mean occasional leftovers. Running errands could bring in a coin or two. In contrast, school offered discipline, expectations, and hunger. To many, it felt like a cruel joke. Go to school, starve. Skip school, eat. The moral message was clear, but the stomach didn't care. And yet, there were those who tried to help. Some teachers quietly kept biscuits in their desks. Some local churches opened breakfast rooms where children could eat before lessons. Social reformers like Margaret Macmillan and Mary Higgs fought for school meals, clean clothing, and medical checks. But they were voices in a storm, battling systems designed not to see the poor. It would take decades before welfare programs were embedded deeply enough to ensure that a child in school wasn't starving. Until then, survival was a private battle. Behind every school book was a silent scream of hunger. Behind every attendance mark was a decision made under duress. And behind every Edwardian child who passed their exams, there was often a night spent cold and empty, with bones aching from hunger. This was not just an education. It was endurance training. The children of the Edwardian poor were not simply students. They were survivors. They learned to spell while fighting hunger pains, learned math while ignoring the coughs of tuberculosis, learned history while their own stories were buried under shame. The classroom was not a place of safety. It was a stage where suffering wore a uniform and sat quietly in rows. And when we speak of progress, we must remember what it cost. Education is a right, but without food, it becomes a torment. You cannot teach a child who is starving. You can only pretend that you've done enough. Street boys were beaten for selling newspapers. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not to go to school or eat breakfast, but to fight for a street corner. You're 9 years old, your fingers are numb, your stomach's empty, and in your hands is a bundle of newspapers that you had to pay for up front. If you don't sell them all, you don't eat. That's not poetic exaggeration. That was real life for thousands of boys across American and British cities during the Gilded Age and early 20th century. They were called newsboys or newsies, and their days were filled not with toys or school, but with shouting, running, and often bleeding. These children weren't just hustling for coins. They were trying to survive a system that didn't see them as kids, but as commodities. In the heart of industrial cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, and even London, these boys, some as young as 6, swarmed the streets with bundles of headlines under their arms. They competed with noise, with traffic, with each other. Extra! Extra! Read all about it. Wasn't just a slogan. It was their cry of desperation. Behind every chant was the weight of hunger. Behind every torn shoe was a child who had likely slept on cold bricks the night before. These weren't just jobs. They were battles. And every day was a war for territory, attention, and enough sales to stay alive. What made their plight even crueler was how the system worked. These boys weren't employed by the newspaper companies. They had to buy the papers in bulk, using whatever coins they could scrape together. If the news was stale or the weather turned sour, tough luck. The papers didn't sell, and the loss was theirs alone. The publishers took no risk. The children took all of it. And if you couldn't sell, you didn't get a refund, you didn't get fed, you got punished. Supervisors, older newsboys, and self-appointed street bosses ruled with fists and belts. A younger boy could be beaten for selling on the wrong corner or for simply failing to meet quotas. Sometimes they were whipped, sometimes robbed. Rival groups guarded intersections like gang turf, and violence was common. Boys were left bloodied in alleys. Fists settled disputes when hunger and desperation made negotiation pointless. The nights offered no comfort. Many of these children had no homes, no parents, and no protection. They slept in doorways, under bridges, on rooftops. Some huddled together in empty barrels or behind hot chimneys to stay warm. They shared lice, sores, stories, and silence. Diseases swept through these street kids like wildfire, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis. Few got medicine, even fewer got sympathy. And yet, society looked the other way. The middle and upper classes saw them as nuisances or pests. Police beat them. Shopkeepers chased them off. But these boys were the backbone of media distribution during an era of explosive urban growth. They carried the headlines that shaped public opinion. They sold the stories that built empires, yet they remained invisible, unprotected, and unheard. The cruelty wasn't only in the beatings, it was in the absence of care. Many never learned to read the very papers they sold. Some were sold into labor rings or recruited into gangs. Others turned to petty theft, not out of malice, but because survival doesn't always wait for virtue. If a child stole an apple or a loaf of bread, it wasn't crime, it was necessity disguised in desperation. But even among these shadows, something remarkable happened. In 1899, the Newsboys of New York organized. When the New York World and New York Journal raised their paper prices after the Spanish-American War and refused to lower them once the war ended, the boys had had enough. They struck. Children who had never been inside a school formed picket lines. They marched through Manhattan carrying signs and shouting slogans. They faced police batons, adult scorn, and starvation. But they didn't break. The strike shocked the city. For over 2 weeks, the boys shut down circulation, blocked delivery wagons, and rallied hundreds to their cause. They weren't asking for handouts. They wanted fairness, respect. And in the end, they forced the publishers to negotiate. The strike didn't eliminate child labor, but it planted a seed. It proved that even the smallest, most ignored voices could shake the pillars of power if they shouted together. Reformers like Jacob Riis and photographers like Louis Hine began documenting the brutal lives of child laborers. Their images showed boys half the size of their stacks, girls asleep on sidewalks, and faces hardened by years they never got to enjoy. Slowly, the public began to shift. Child labor laws were proposed. Institutions were challenged. By the 1910s and 20s, limits on child street labor began to appear. But enforcement was weak, and in poor neighborhoods, the newsboy tradition endured well into the 1930s and beyond. Today, the image of the newsboy is often softened, romanticized by musicals, movies, and nostalgic paintings. A smiling kid in a cap joyfully selling the front page. But that image is a mask. It hides the bruises, the broken teeth, the frostbitten fingers, and the empty stomachs. It hides the fact that behind every cheerful "paper, mister," was a child enduring a silent war with poverty. And that is why this history matters. Not just because it's true, but because it's a warning. When society allows children to be treated as tools, when profit matters more than protection, suffering becomes invisible. We forget that labor laws weren't gifts. They were earned by children who bled for them, by boys who stood in rainstorms, dodged fists, and dared to strike against giants. So the next time you see a romantic sketch of a newsie smiling on a curb, remember the thousands who didn't smile, who were beaten, exploited, and discarded, all for failing to sell enough papers. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose never to allow again. Children died in workhouses from overwork and disease. They called it salvation. A roof over your head, food on your plate, work to give your life meaning. That's what the workhouses promised to the poor. But behind those stone walls, beyond the barred windows and the hollow sermons of reformers, was a different reality. One shaped not by mercy, but by survival. For children especially, it was a world of silence, hunger, and labor that had no end. In Victorian Britain, poverty was treated like a disease, one you cured by punishment. And so, when families fell into debt or misfortune, the state offered them a choice: the workhouse or the streets. For many, especially orphans, there was no choice at all. Children were taken in under the pretense of care, but care was not what they received. Their days began before the sun rose, often at 5 a.m., with cold water, thin gruel, and tasks far beyond their years. They worked long hours sorting raw wool, breaking stones, crushing bones for fertilizer. Their fingers bled from picking oakum, old rope fibers soaked in tar, unraveled by hand. It was monotonous, mind-numbing work that left blisters and cuts, often infected and untreated. Girls as young as 6 were made to wash heavy laundry in cold water for hours. Boys were forced to pump water, grind grain, or work in crude factory settings built into the very institutions meant to protect them. Their backs bent, their eyesight dimmed, their innocence evaporated. Food was meager. A bowl of watery porridge, bread so coarse swallowed it shredded gums, or a turnip soup so bland it barely tasted of life. Seconds were forbidden. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs as cruelly as the labor drained their strength. And yet, asking for more meant punishment, solitary confinement, beatings, or starvation rations. In some workhouses, children were made to eat in silence, heads down, as if guilt came with every bite. Disease was everywhere. The rooms were overcrowded, damp, and poorly ventilated. Tuberculosis spread from bed to bed like smoke. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery tore through dormitories with deadly efficiency. Doctors were few. Medical attention, if given at all, was crude and dismissive. Children died in their bunks, sometimes fevered and hallucinating, whispering for mothers who never came. Others died on the floor, collapsed from exhaustion while sweeping or carrying water. And when death came, it did so quietly. No name in the paper, no funeral, just a burial in a pauper's grave, shared with strangers. What made it worse was the philosophy behind it all. Reformers of the time didn't believe in generosity. They believed in deterrence. The workhouse was intentionally cruel so the poor wouldn't grow dependent. Children weren't seen as victims. They were treated as future burdens. By making their lives hard now, the logic went, society might scare others into staying employed, staying obedient, staying quiet. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning carved into the flesh of the powerless. Many of these children were separated from their parents. Even siblings were often torn apart on arrival, boys to one wing, girls to another. They might glimpse each other across the courtyard or hear muffled crying through the walls at night. But contact was forbidden. This wasn't a family home. It was an institution, and institutions don't tolerate emotion. Stories emerged, too many to count. Of a boy who died after falling from a scaffold he was forced to clean. Of a girl who bled for days before anyone noticed she was sick. of children locked in dark rooms for misbehaving or made to scrub toilets with their bare hands. Some survived and spoke later, decades on, their voices shaking with age and memory. But most never left. They grew up in the system, hollowed out, or they died before they could even understand what life might have been. And yet society looked the other way. The gates were tall, the walls were clean. On the outside, the workhouse seemed orderly, even noble. It wasn't until inspectors and journalists began peering inside in the late 19th century that the truth gained light. Reports of malnourishment, of children with sunken cheeks and bruised wrists, of wards with no blankets in winter and no toys ever. Eventually, reforms came, slowly, reluctantly. New laws were passed. Some workhouses shut down, others softened their rules. But the damage had been done. Generations were lost, not to war, not to plague, but to a system that mistook discipline for morality and poverty for guilt. And children in the thousands were its casualties. Even today, their names are largely gone. Their records are buried in old ledgers, if at all. But their suffering shaped the very idea of social care. Their stories remain etched into the floorboards of old institutions turned into offices or flats. Sometimes, when those places are renovated, workers find tiny shoes hidden in the walls, left there as charms or offerings or just forgotten. A silent cry preserved in wood and dust. We remember them not to romanticize suffering, but to confront the brutal truth that systems built without empathy will always consume the weakest first. These children were not criminals. They were not broken. They were simply poor. And for that, they were sentenced, not by a judge, but by a society that chose order over kindness. The workhouses promised structure. What they delivered was sorrow. And for the smallest, most vulnerable among them, that sorrow often ended in a shallow grave. But today, we can still speak their names, even if the records do not. We can still light a candle in the dark rooms where they once shivered, and we can vow never again to confuse punishment with care or obedience with dignity. Girls worked in match factories until their faces rotted. Imagine walking into a room where the air itself could kill you. The light flickers. The smell is sharp, sweet, acrid, and strangely metallic. Girls as young as 12 sit in long rows at wooden tables, their fingers stained yellow, their skin glistening with sweat, their lungs filling with poison. They're not criminals or prisoners. They're factory workers, and their job is to dip matchsticks into white phosphorus, a substance so dangerous it doesn't just sicken. It rots the face from the inside out. This was the fate of thousands of working-class girls in 19th century England and Europe, and the price they paid was something no wage could ever justify. They called it phossy jaw, short for a phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. It began innocently, a sore tooth, a swollen gum. But then came the ulcers, the pus, the unbearable pain. Over time, the jawbone itself would turn black, crumble, and disintegrate, sometimes falling out piece by piece. The stench was horrifying. People could smell a victim before they saw her. In the final stages, some girls' faces became so disfigured they were unrecognizable. And all of this happened while they were still teenagers, trying to earn a few pennies to survive. The match industry exploded during the Victorian era. It was a symbol of modern life, a little stick that could bring light with a single strike. But behind that flame was an industry soaked in suffering. Factories like the infamous Bryant and May in London employed hundreds of girls in shifts that ran 12 to 14 hours a day. The work was repetitive and dangerous. The girls stood or sat for hours, dipping the sticks into vats of white phosphorus paste. There were no gloves, no masks, no safety training, and no escape from the fumes that floated through the factory like an invisible predator. Management knew the risks. As early as the 1840s, medical journals described the connection between phosphorus exposure and necrosis of the jaw. The disease didn't occur in people who used red phosphorus, which was safer but more expensive. But white phosphorus was cheap. And profits came first. So the owners kept hiring more girls, desperate, voiceless, replaceable. They fined them for speaking, docked pay for broken matches, and ignored complaints of illness. When girls grew too sick to work, they were simply let go. At home, families often couldn't afford doctors. They would see their daughters wasting away, their breath foul, their mouths leaking pus, their faces swelling grotesquely. In desperation, some underwent primitive surgeries to remove parts of their jawbones. Others turned to opium for the pain. Many died young, buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost in the shadows of industrial progress. What made this even more brutal was how invisible it was to the wider society. Middle-class families struck their matches each night without ever thinking of where they came from. The suffering was contained behind factory walls, hidden behind the modest wages these girls brought home. But eventually, the silence cracked. In 1888, a group of workers at Bryant and May, over 1,400 girls, walked out in protest. They had endured too much. Led by activist Annie Besant, they told the world what was happening inside. The Match Girls' strike became a turning point. Newspapers began reporting the horrors. The British public, for the first time, saw the human cost of the matches they used daily. The strike led to improved conditions, increased pay, and eventually a movement to ban white phosphorus entirely. It took decades. And even after the ban, many countries continued using it in secret for years. But the strike remains one of the earliest and most powerful examples of industrial protest led by women and by children. Still, the damage had been done. Thousands had already suffered, many beyond healing. Phossy Jaw left survivors disfigured and socially ostracized. They couldn't find other jobs. Many couldn't marry. Some lived the rest of their lives in pain and poverty, abandoned by the very system they had helped to build. In a cruel twist of irony, their own labor had illuminated homes across Europe, yet their own futures were shrouded in darkness. White phosphorus wasn't just toxic, it was symbolic. It burned brightly, instantly, seductively. And it destroyed slowly, just like the system that employed it. The girls who worked in those factories weren't just workers, they were victims of an industrial revolution that chose speed and profit over life and dignity. Their bodies became the battlegrounds of progress, their bones the collateral damage of modern convenience. Today, their stories are rarely told. A few skulls with hollow jaws lie in medical museums. A few photos from the strike survive in archives. But most of their names are lost. They died quietly, uncelebrated. Some were buried in mass pauper graves. Others simply vanished from the record, another child worker gone before 20. But we should not forget them. Their story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a mirror held up to every society that prioritizes profit over protection, speed over safety, silence over justice. When we celebrate industrial achievements, we must also honor those who were crushed beneath their gears. The flame of a match may seem small, but for the girls who made them, that flame cost everything. Children were flogged in public by schoolmasters. Imagine walking into a classroom not with a backpack and books, but with fear in your chest and welts on your back. The walls smell of ink and damp stone, but what fills the room isn't curiosity. It's silence. A silence enforced by the cane resting on the schoolmaster's desk. One mistake, one wrong answer, one glance out the window, and that cane might find your hands, your back, or worse, your soul. For centuries, school wasn't just a place of learning, it was a place of punishment. From the 1600s through the early 1900s, in Europe and beyond, children were flogged for infractions as small as messy handwriting or mispronouncing Latin. The instruments varied: birch rods, leather straps, thick wooden canes. But the message was the same: obedience was more important than understanding. And brutality was part of the lesson plan. Discipline wasn't hidden. It was spectacle. In many schools, especially those rooted in religious or military tradition, punishment was carried out in full view of the class. The offender would be called forward, made to kneel or bend over a bench, and then struck, sometimes 5, 10, 20 times, while classmates watched. The idea was deterrence: let the pain of one teach the rest. But what it really taught was fear. And the fear was constant. Imagine being 7 years old, knowing that a single ink blot might mean lashes. that your inability to recite a passage, perhaps because you were hungry, tired, or ill, could be met with blows. Boys were often the main targets, though girls were not exempt. In some countries, teachers were even judged by how effectively they maintained order, not through learning outcomes, but through how well they kept children quiet and controlled. The psychological impact was enormous. Many children associated learning with pain. Some developed tics, others became mute from terror. For some, the trauma followed them into adulthood, crippling their confidence, warping their perception of authority, and embedding shame deep within their memory. In 18th century England, the phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," was taken almost literally. In elite boarding schools like Eton and Harrow, caning became ritualized. Some students were beaten daily. Prefects, older students, were often allowed to flog younger ones. And for those who resisted, the punishment was doubled. In Prussia, the birthplace of the modern compulsory school system, strict regimentation was enforced not just through schedules, but through corporal punishment. Schools were meant to mold obedient citizens and soldiers. Individuality, imagination, and emotional expression were seen as threats to discipline. The classroom became a boot camp of the mind, and the rod, its whip. Religious schools added another layer. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was moral. You were being beaten not just for disobedience, but for sin. Teachers, often priests or clergy, believed pain could cleanse the soul. A mistake in Scripture, a moment of inattention, could bring the wrath of both man and God. And students, some as young as 6, absorbed not just bruises, but guilt. Girls, too, faced brutality, especially in institutions designed to correct behavior. In Ireland's infamous Magdalen laundries, girls were beaten for speaking out of turn or being suspected of impurity. In Victorian workhouse schools, orphaned or poor children were subjected to punishments designed not only to correct, but to humiliate, standing for hours, wearing shame badges, being denied food, and yet, for generations, this was normalized. Parents expected it. Governments allowed it. Teachers were not questioned. They were feared. A child who came home with bruises was often asked, "What did you do wrong?" rather than, "What did they do to you?" The scars, emotional and physical, lasted a lifetime. Diaries from the 19th century tell of boys who wet themselves in fear every morning before class, of girls who stopped speaking altogether. Some students grew into adults who enforced the same discipline they once received, passing the pain forward like a twisted heirloom. Others swore never to let their own children be touched, breaking the chain, but still haunted by memories they couldn't forget. It wasn't until the 20th century that serious reform began. Activists, psychologists, and brave former students spoke out. Studies showed the damage, how violence didn't teach discipline, only silence, how it created not strong citizens, but wounded ones. Gradually, laws changed. In Britain, corporal punishment was banned in state schools by 1986. In many parts of Europe, similar reforms followed, but even today, in parts of the world, the rod is still used. In homes, in schools, in institutions that call themselves educational. What does it mean to teach through fear? What kind of knowledge is born under the sting of a strap? The answer is simple, not knowledge at all, just obedience, just survival. A real education nurtures, questions, opens the mind. It doesn't close it in pain. And the classroom should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. So next time we look back at the good old days of discipline, remember this. For millions of children, school was not a place of growth. It was a chamber of control. And their tears, spilled quietly beneath wooden desks, built the foundations of an educational system that we are still trying to unchain. No child should have to learn through terror. No mistake deserves a scar. Poor kids were locked in cribs to keep them quiet. Picture a dim Edwardian room with peeling wallpaper, a cracked window, and a crib pushed against the wall. Inside lies a child, barely 2 years old, wrapped in rags, tied to the bars with a strip of cloth, or sealed in with a board nailed across the top. The air is stale with the smell of milk gone sour and the cold breath of coal smoke. No one is coming to pick the child up anytime soon. The mother is gone, working in a factory or scrubbing floors somewhere, and this was the only way to keep the child safe. Not warm, not happy, just alive. In working-class Edwardian Britain, poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a sentence. For mothers, it meant a brutal trade-off between survival and safety. Most poor women didn't have the luxury of staying home to raise children. They worked long, exhausting hours outside the home, often leaving behind infants and toddlers who were too young to understand or protest. But babies cry, they move, they crawl into danger. So mothers, desperate, exhausted, and out of options, improvised. The most common method was confinement. Makeshift cribs were built from old furniture or crates and then enclosed with lids, ropes, or boards. In some cases, children were tied to chairs or beds. The aim wasn't cruelty, it was containment. If a child couldn't get out, they couldn't burn themselves on a stove or fall down the stairs. But it meant they often sat for hours in soiled clothing, unfed, unchanged, and completely alone. In slums across London, Manchester, and Liverpool, housing was overcrowded, cold, and poorly ventilated. In a single room shared by an entire family, there was no nursery, no toys, no stimulation. The crib became not a place of sleep, but of imprisonment. Infants could be locked in for 8 to 12 hours while their mother worked, with neighbors sometimes checking in. But often, no one did. And sometimes, when the mother returned home, the child was dead, strangled in their own bindings, suffocated on the mattress, or simply frozen to death beside a cracked window. Official reports from the period document horrifying cases. Inquests told of children found frozen stiff in cribs left by open windows, or of babies so malnourished they hadn't gained weight in months. Investigators described homes where the crib was covered with boards, nailed shut like a cage. Mothers testified through tears, saying they had no choice. They didn't want to do it. But if they brought the child with them to the mill, they'd be fired. If they left the child alone, it might wander into traffic. So they restrained them. And hoped. Social reformers tried to intervene. Women like Margaret Macmillan campaigned for nursery schools where working mothers could leave their children safely. But the funding was scarce, and suspicion was high. Poor families distrusted institutions that might take their children away permanently. So the practice of crib restraint continued, hidden behind closed doors and shuttered tenement windows. It wasn't just physical danger. The emotional toll on these children was profound. Modern psychologists describe the effects of early childhood neglect as akin to trauma. Being left alone in silence hour after hour, day after day, without comfort or human contact, can alter brain development. Many of these children grew up with speech delays, emotional detachment, or deep anxiety. But in 1900, such effects weren't understood. A quiet child was seen as a good child. And if the child stopped crying altogether, parents sometimes thought they had been trained. The truth was darker. Even when these practices were discovered, the blame often fell entirely on the mother. Newspapers ran judgmental stories about neglectful women without ever asking why they had no help. There was no maternity leave, no subsidized childcare, no support system. Just a mother facing impossible choices: lose your job and starve, or restrain your baby and live with the guilt. One notorious case involved a woman in Leeds who returned home to find her baby dead in a crate where she had left him that morning. The baby had tipped sideways and suffocated. The woman was charged with manslaughter. But in court, it was revealed that she had begged her employer to let her bring the child and been refused. She had gone to neighbors for help, and none could take the baby. In the end, she wept in silence as the verdict was read. The public condemned her. But what they failed to see was the system that put her in that position to begin with. In some workhouses and charitable institutions, children were kept in similar confinement even when their mothers were present. Cribs with lids were used to discipline noisy infants. Silence was prized over comfort. The goal wasn't nurture, it was order. In overcrowded poorhouses, infants were not seen as persons, but burdens to be contained. Yet in all this darkness there were rare points of light. A few pioneering nursery centers opened in urban areas, offering safety and companionship for the very young. Some were run by churches or social reformers, but they were overwhelmed. Hundreds applied. Dozens got in. And, for the rest, the locked crib remained a reality. This was the hidden cost of industrial progress, the unseen, unspoken toll on the youngest lives. While the adult world focused on production, on schedules, on wages and efficiency, the infants of the poor lay in silence, bound in cribs that kept them safe, but also alone. This wasn't parenting. It was survival strategy under siege. And when we speak of the working poor, we must remember the ones who couldn't work, couldn't speak, couldn't choose, the babies behind the bars. They didn't cry for attention because no one came. They didn't resist because they were too small to understand what was happening. Their lives were measured in stillness. They deserved comfort. They deserved warmth. They deserved to be held. But in the factories and slums of Edwardian Britain, even a mother's arms had a time limit. And so they were locked away, not because they were unloved, but because love alone couldn't keep them safe. Child performers collapsed on stage from exhaustion. Imagine the velvet curtain rising, the gaslights flaring to life, and a room full of strangers applauding as a tiny child steps into the spotlight. Her smile is painted on. Her makeup hides the dark circles beneath her eyes. Her shoes pinch, her corset cuts, and the song she sings she's already performed 20 times this week. What the audience doesn't see is that moments before she walked on stage, she was throwing up from hunger. What they don't hear is the backstage threat. Mess it up, and there'll be no dinner tonight. This was the hidden reality of the child performer, exhausted, underfed, exploited, and applauded. Before there were movie studios or pop idols, the stage was king. The music halls of London, the vaudeville theaters of New York, the traveling street acts of Paris, all relied on spectacle. And nothing drew a crowd like the novelty of a talented child. Children sang, danced, acted, tumbled, juggled, mimicked, and performed tricks. They were adored by the crowd, but rarely protected. They weren't seen as children. They were investments, tools. And if they broke, there was always another. Some began performing as toddlers, barely able to pronounce the lyrics they were forced to memorize. Their routines were grueling, their training relentless. They were often kept awake with caffeine, slapped awake before shows, or given alcohol to calm the nerves. They worked under searing gaslight and hot footlights that burned their faces and made them faint. Their costumes were often too tight, sometimes toxic with lead-based dyes or dangerously flammable. Sweat mixed with fear as they twirled on splintered stages, always smiling, because not smiling meant punishment. Many children performed multiple shows each day, 7 days a week, without rest. Rehearsals filled the hours in between. Travel was constant. Sleep was broken. Food was inconsistent. Cold soup, crusts of bread, sometimes nothing at all. The stage demanded perfection, and if they faltered, the price was paid in bruises or withheld meals. Some collapsed mid-performance, fainting in front of cheering crowds who thought it was part of the act. They were dragged backstage, revived with ammonia, and pushed out again. Backstage was rarely safer. Parents and managers, some well-meaning, many not, often controlled every aspect of the child's life. Their earnings were pocketed, their contracts manipulated. Some never saw a cent of the fortunes they generated. They were property, not people. And when their voices changed or their looks faded, they were discarded, too old to charm, too broken to fight back. On the streets, the conditions were even worse. Children busked on corners or outside theaters, dancing in rags, swallowing fire, singing over the roar of carts and factories. Winter brought frostbite. Summer brought sunstroke. Police chased them, gangs robbed them. Passers-by tossed coins but never stopped to ask who these children were or what it cost them to survive. They spun in circles, danced until dizzy, sang until hoarse, because every second they stopped, hunger got closer. And then there were the traveling circuses and freak shows. Children with unusual features or deformities were displayed like curiosities. Dwarfs were made to act as clowns. Children with medical conditions were given cruel stage names and forced to perform humiliating acts. There were no unions, no therapy, no one to say, enough. If you cried, you were weak. If you collapsed, you were lazy. The audience never saw the fear beneath the grease paint. Even those who reached stardom paid a terrible price. Consider Lena Zavaroni, the Scottish singer who rose to fame at age 10. Her talent was extraordinary, but so was the pressure. She developed anorexia, depression, and died in her 30s after years of mental and physical suffering. Or Master Betty, an 11-year-old boy hailed as a theatrical prodigy in the 1800s, paraded by his father until his health failed and his fame vanished. Their stories are not rare exceptions. They are echoes of a pattern repeated across generations. Efforts to regulate child performance came slowly. The UK's Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act in 1889 and later U.S. labor laws were attempts to stop the worst abuses. But entertainment industries always found loopholes. Agents forged documents. Doctors were bribed, age limits were ignored, and audiences didn't ask questions. They just clapped. If the child smiled and the show went on, that was enough. Only when child labor reformers and muckraking journalists began documenting the behind-the-scenes realities did public awareness begin to shift. Photographs showed skeletal children backstage, legs wrapped in bandages, faces blank with exhaustion. Testimonies revealed the pain behind the curtain, the manipulation, the fear, the total erasure of childhood. Even today, the problem hasn't fully vanished. The faces may be brighter, the stages grander, but the questions remain. How many child stars are still being controlled, shaped, and spent like currency? Who decides when they rest, when they eat, what they wear, and what happens when the spotlight fades? Because performance, when it becomes survival, is no longer art. It's endurance, and no child should have to endure that just to be seen. So the next time you see a child center stage perfectly posed beneath dazzling lights, don't just ask how talented they are. Ask how tired they are. Ask who profits. Ask what's hiding behind the applause, because applause fades, but the scars often don't. Shoe shiners were robbed, beaten, and abused. They were barely visible at street level. Just boys, some no older than 6, kneeling on sidewalks, clutching wooden boxes filled with brushes, polish, and silent hope. To passers-by, they were just part of the scenery, background fixtures in the loud machinery of urban life. But in truth, every child shoe shiner was engaged in a daily battle not just for coins, but for safety, survival, and dignity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities across the world, from London and New York to Bombay and Buenos Aires, were flooded with children forced into street trades. Among them, the shoe shine boys became iconic. Perched on corners, outside train stations or hotels, they worked from dawn to dusk, calling out to gentlemen in top hats or workers in dusty boots. A shine cost just a few pennies. But for these boys, every coin was a lifeline. Most were orphans or the sons of desperately poor families. There was no childhood waiting at home, no dinner table, no books, no bedtime stories, just the streets. And the streets didn't play fair. Bigger boys ran the corners. Gangs, some adult-led, others run by older kids, treated younger shiners like property. If a child earned well, they were followed and robbed. If they resisted, they were beaten. Some were dragged into alleyways, stripped of their boxes, their earnings, and sometimes their ability to trust again. And then came the protection rackets. Organized street gangs would demand a cut of every shine, calling it rent for working their corner. If a boy refused, he might wake up the next day to find his kit destroyed. Or worse, he'd be beaten so badly he couldn't work at all. Injuries were common: broken fingers, blackened eyes, missing teeth. Yet the police rarely intervened. To them, these children weren't victims. They were nuisances, street rats, disposable. Some boys were roped into worse. Older criminals would recruit them, not for their skill with polish, but for their small hands and smaller sense of consequence. Children became pickpockets, distractions, drug couriers. They'd shine shoes in the morning and steal purses by afternoon, not because they were born bad, but because the system offered no good choices. It was survival. And in the alleys of power and poverty, survival rarely comes clean. And yet, these boys carried themselves with a strange sort of pride. Many hand-built their boxes, customizing them with compartments, straps, or secret pockets to hide coins. They learned to read customers, who tipped, who kicked, who lingered too long. They competed for territory, mastered the art of speed, shine, and charm. Some even created their own coded slang to talk about trouble before it arrived. Behind the polish and rags was resilience forged in fire. But that didn't stop the cruelty. Some boys slept beside their boxes, fearing theft. Others were chased away by police enforcing vagrancy laws. Ironically, the very children who made the city shine were treated as its stain. When city councils wanted to clean up downtown areas, the first to be pushed out were the kids who scrubbed shoes and begged for bread. Even well-meaning reformers often misunderstood the reality. They built shelters and schools, but they didn't protect corners. They didn't stop the gangs. And many boys, suspicious of authority, stayed away. For some, the box was their only identity. Losing it meant losing not just income, but self. Newspapers occasionally ran stories, usually when a boy was found dead in a back alley, or when a kind gentleman paid for one child's education. But for every story that reached the page, 100 others disappeared into silence. There were no obituaries for the lost, no memorials for the bruised, just broken boys grown into broken men or buried before either could happen. And this didn't happen in one country or one decade. It was everywhere. In colonial cities, European capitals, American boomtowns, anywhere wealth and poverty collided. The shoe shiner became a symbol of industry, of grit, of childhood on the edge. And yet, behind every symbol was a child carrying more than a box. They carried fear, hunger, hope, sometimes shame, often bruises, always weight that no child should ever be asked to bear. Over time, machines replaced polishers, modern labor laws cracked down, social programs improved, and the armies of child shoe shiners slowly faded. But in some parts of the world, they still remain. You can still find them. Tiny boys with polish-stained hands offering a shine for change, dodging fists and thieves, surviving a system that pretends not to see them. Their story isn't just about child labor, it's about how society looks away, how it convinces itself that a working child is better than a starving one, how it tolerates the abuse of innocence so long as the shoes are clean and the streets are quiet, and how even today the smallest workers are too often the least protected. So the next time you hear the phrase, "pull yourself up by your bootstraps," remember, there were children who never had boots, only brushes, only polish, only the desperate promise that if they worked hard enough, someone might notice them, might spare them, might one day let them be children again. Children were used to test dangerous products. Imagine being handed a bottle of unknown liquid and told to dip your hands in it for hours. Or being locked in a room thick with chemical fumes, no mask, no gloves, just your skin, your eyes, your lungs. And you're not a scientist, not an adult. You're a child, barely 10, maybe 12. In the dim, unregulated factories of the 19th and early 20th centuries, children weren't just laborers. They were human litmus tests. Before ethics, before clinical trials, before product safety labels, the first line of exposure to dangerous chemicals was often a child's body. And no one asked for their consent. Across Europe and the United States, the Industrial Revolution produced a hunger for new products, brighter paints, longer-lasting dyes, stronger cleaners, faster manufacturing compounds. But behind every innovation was a human cost, and that cost was often paid in small hands and fragile lungs. Factories churned out synthetic dyes, oil paints, cosmetics, and solvents, often without understanding their long-term effects. And instead of using controlled studies or adult testers, industries quietly allowed child workers to be the canaries in a toxic mine. Boys were sent into dusty storerooms to mix pigments that contained lead, arsenic, or mercury. Girls worked with powders and pastes that soaked into their skin. They weren't told the risks. They didn't understand the chemistry. They simply obeyed orders. Some were told to paint toys with lead-based colors that caused dizziness and tremors. Others dipped fabrics into vats of dye containing aniline compounds, later discovered to be highly carcinogenic. Some children mixed cleaning agents that included benzene, turpentine, and lye. The chemicals burned their eyes, corroded their fingers, and in some cases caused paralysis. These weren't accidental exposures. This was institutionalized negligence disguised as opportunity. Children were cheaper to hire, less likely to protest, and easier to replace. Their bodies were smaller, perfect for crawling into vats, climbing machinery, or handling delicate items coated in dangerous substances. If a product caused blistering, rashes, or blindness, it wasn't the chemical that was blamed. It was the child. They were too weak, too clumsy, unreliable. And so the cycle repeated. In many cases, the effects weren't immediate. A child might work for months before symptoms appeared: memory loss, loss of appetite, fatigue, skin lesions, blurred vision. Doctors often misdiagnosed them or dismissed their symptoms as malingering. Parents, often desperate for any income, tolerated the risk. A few extra pennies a day could feed the rest of the family. And in neighborhoods where hunger bit harder than fear, long-term health was a luxury no one could afford to think about. In some of the most horrifying instances, children were exposed deliberately. Reports exist of factory supervisors applying newly invented creams, sprays, and dyes directly onto children's skin or faces to see what would happen. Eye drops containing silver nitrate, cleaning solutions tested on open wounds, cosmetics smeared across teenage cheeks. There were no safety boards, no liability. If a child became ill, they were let go and quietly replaced. Their names never made it into medical journals. Their stories were never told. They simply disappeared, into graveyards, into hospitals, or into the fog of collective denial. The long-term consequences were devastating. Some survivors reached adulthood with nerve damage so severe they couldn't hold a pen. Others developed chronic respiratory disease, heart complications, or neurological disorders. Some were left infertile. Others suffered mental breakdowns. But the majority never made it that far. They died in adolescence, unremarked and unremembered, sacrificed for the speed of commerce and the price of innovation. Reform came, but slowly, painfully, and only after outrage. Journalists began exposing factory conditions. Physicians started correlating workplace chemicals with specific symptoms. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 marked a turning point, followed by the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. In the UK and Europe, child labor laws tightened, but enforcement remained weak, and in many cases, companies simply relocated their most dangerous operations to more lenient regions. Even today, echoes of this practice remain. In parts of the developing world, children still work in chemical-intensive industries: tanning leather, dyeing fabric, recycling electronics. The details have changed, the dangers haven't, and the silence around their suffering is hauntingly familiar. The children who were used to test dangerous products rarely left behind records. No court cases, no compensation, no monuments. But every warning label we now read, every banned ingredient, every regulation was paid for in part by their suffering. Their stories are hidden in factory logs, forgotten hospital wards, and faded photographs. They weren't volunteers. They were victims, and we owe them more than silence. They remind us that progress without conscience is peril, that innovation without protection is exploitation, and that every convenience we enjoy today, every bright color, smooth surface, clean smell, came with a cost. The question is, do we remember who paid it? Boy soldiers lied about their age and died in war. Imagine being 14 years old but standing on the front line with a rifle that's nearly as tall as you are. The mud reaches your knees. The sound of gunfire never stops. All around you, grown men fall, and yet no one sees you as a child. Not because you've grown up, but because you lied. You lied about your age to serve a country that never asked why. That's not a story from fiction. That's what thousands of underage boys did during World War I, and many of them never came back. In the fevered climate of 1914, as war broke out across Europe, Britain launched a massive recruitment campaign. The call to arms was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, and speeches. Your country needs you. And for boys raised on empire, duty, and honor, the message hit hard. Some saw their older brothers enlist, some watched their fathers go, and many couldn't stand the thought of being left behind, so they lied. The legal age for military service in Britain was 18. You couldn't be sent to fight overseas until 19. But recruiters, desperate to meet quotas, overwhelmed by volunteers, rarely asked questions. If you said you were 18, they looked you over and nodded. If you were tall enough, strong enough, or simply bold enough, you were in. No birth certificate required, no questions asked. Some boys were just 15. A few were only 14. The youngest confirmed British soldier to die in World War I was John Condon, believed to be just 14 years old when he was killed by poison gas in Belgium. His grave reads, age 14, surrounded by those of grown men. But he wasn't alone. Historians estimate that as many as 250,000 underage boys served in the British Army during the war. Many never saw their 16th birthday. Life in the trenches was hell for even the strongest men. For boys, many of whom had never left their villages, it was pure trauma. Freezing winters, rotting corpses, machine gun fire, gas attacks. And the constant thunder of artillery that shook the earth and shattered nerves. Boys who once played with wooden swords were now bayoneting enemies, carrying wounded comrades, watching friends bleed out in the mud. They were often treated like any other soldier. Some were mocked for their youth. Others earned nicknames like the baby or little brother. But when the bullets came, there was no discrimination. Shells didn't ask for ID. One moment you were alive. The next, scattered across no man's land, just another body, in a war that consumed an entire generation. In letters home, some boys pretended all was fine. They didn't want to worry their mothers. They joked about the food, described adventures. But between the lines, fear leaked through. Some wrote of watching friends die, of sleepless nights, of praying for silence. One 15-year-old wrote, "We go over tomorrow. If I don't come back, tell Dad I hope I made him proud." He didn't return. There were efforts to stop it. Officials tried to remove boys when proof of age surfaced. Some were sent back, but many had no papers, and some officers looked the other way, believing that anyone willing to fight deserved the chance. In the madness of war, rules bent and young lives snapped. Some underage boys were even decorated for bravery. Sidney Lewis lied about his age and joined at 14. He fought in the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles in history. His true age was only discovered when his mother sent his birth certificate to the War Office, demanding his return. He was pulled out and sent home. But for every Sidney, there were dozens who weren't so lucky. The tragedy didn't end with the war. For the survivors, trauma lingered. Some returned home with physical wounds, missing limbs, shrapnel scars, damaged lungs from gas. But many bore invisible wounds, nightmares, depression, a shattered sense of identity. They had gone to war as boys, returned as ghosts, and tried to re-enter a world that no longer made sense. And society didn't always welcome them. There were no parades for the child soldiers, no special recognition. Often, their lives were still on record, so their pensions were denied. Some struggled to find work. Others drank, wandered, or disappeared. The war had asked for their youth and taken their futures in return. Today, memorials across Europe carry the names of the fallen. But most plaques don't say age 15. They simply list ranks and regiments. The boys who died are remembered as men, their childhoods buried alongside them. It's easy to romanticize patriotism, to admire bravery. But what price did we place on innocence? What does it mean when a nation allows its children to die in adult wars? And what does it say that many had to lie just to be accepted? We look back now and wonder, how did we let this happen? But the truth is, some still do. Around the world today, children are still used in conflict, still holding rifles, still forced into battles they didn't choose. The uniforms have changed, the language has changed, but the grief is the same. So when we remember the Great War, let's not only remember the generals or the victory speeches. Let's remember the boys who wore boots too big, carried rifles too heavy, and died in trenches before they ever kissed someone they loved or learned who they really were. They wanted to be heroes, but they were only children. Children were jailed for stealing bread or coal. Imagine a child no taller than the cell door being led away in handcuffs. His crime? Stealing a lump of coal from a delivery cart or a crust of bread from a bakery window. The year is 1904. The place, industrial Britain, and the law does not care that it is winter, that the child is barefoot, or that his siblings are sick and shivering in a one-room tenement. Theft was theft, and prison was prison, even if the thief was 7 years old. In Edwardian Britain, poverty was not a shield against prosecution. In fact, it made you a target. With little social welfare and rampant unemployment, survival often depended on desperate choices. Children were sent out by parents not to play or study, but to forage, scavenge, and sometimes steal. A pocketful of coal could mean warmth for a night. A stolen potato could be the difference between dinner and hunger. But if caught, the punishment was swift and unforgiving. The justice system treated these young offenders as criminals, not victims. Court records from the time are filled with heartbreaking entries. Age 8, convicted of stealing bread. Sentence, 14 days hard labor. Or boy, age 10, caught with firewood. Sentence, 3 months in Borstal. There were no allowances for age, no concern for circumstance. The idea of juvenile justice was still in its infancy. And for many magistrates, discipline mattered more than mercy. The conditions awaiting these children were brutal. If sent to jail, they were locked in cold, damp cells, often in isolation. Some were forced to pick oakum, tearing apart old ropes with bloodied fingers, or scrub prison floors for hours. Meals were minimal. Talking was forbidden. Time passed in silence and fear, and even upon release, the stain of criminality followed them. A child with a prison record often struggled to find work later in life, deepening the cycle of poverty. And the sentences didn't always match the crimes. One 9-year-old boy in Yorkshire was sentenced to 2 months for stealing apples. Another girl, aged 11, was imprisoned for taking coal from a rail yard to warm her dying grandmother. Her court testimony, barely audible through tears, described how she had waited until dark and filled her apron with loose coals. "I just wanted Gran to be warm," she said. But the judge responded coldly, "Theft is theft, no matter the reason." Some were sent not to adult jails, but to institutions like reformatories or industrial schools. But these were no havens. Children here were subjected to rigid routines, physical punishment, and forced labor. They woke before dawn, marched in rows, and were caned for disobedience. The goal was not education, it was correction. These places were designed to break the will, not rebuild the soul. Why didn't society intervene? Because the suffering of the poor was normalized. Newspapers ran stories of child thieves with headlines like "Little Rogues Punished" or "Tiny Terror of the Market." Rarely did they ask why a child would risk prison for bread. And the upper classes, insulated from the chill of hunger, viewed poverty as a moral failing, not a systemic collapse. They believed a stint in prison would teach a lesson. But what lesson does a child truly learn in chains? Some reformers did try to change things. People like Mary Carpenter and the Fabian Society lobbied for juvenile courts and separate institutions for young offenders. The 1908 Children Act eventually established juvenile courts and prohibited the imprisonment of children under 14 in adult prisons. But until then, the practice continued for decades. Thousands of children were jailed like adults for trying to survive. And even after reforms, the social stigma remained. Children released from reformatories were often viewed with suspicion. Employers avoided them. Schools shamed them. Friends drifted away. The very system that claimed to rehabilitate them ensured they stayed trapped in the very conditions that had led them to steal in the first place. These children weren't career criminals. They weren't predators or con artists. They were hungry, cold, desperate. They stole not for greed, but for warmth and survival. But the law made no room for nuance. A loaf of bread became a crime. A lump of coal became a sentence. Even more tragic were the cases where siblings were separated by the justice system. Older children often took the blame to protect their younger brothers and sisters. One documented case involved a 13-year-old girl who confessed to stealing coal, though witnesses suspected it was her 6-year-old brother who had done it. She said nothing in court except that she didn't want him to get the belt. She was sentenced to a month of confinement. Her brother waited outside the courthouse, clutching her scarf. These stories were not rare. They were routine. They happened in alleyways and marketplaces, in bakeries and coal yards. They unfolded in silence, hidden behind the language of legality. But each one was a story of love twisted into desperation. A story where the only way to show care was to risk punishment. And when the world forgets those stories, it forgets what justice is supposed to mean. Because real justice doesn't measure crime in isolation. It sees the child in context. It sees the cold, the hunger, the aching need. It understands that when a child steals bread, it's not a flaw in the child, it's a failure in the world around them. So when we speak of crime, of punishment, of justice, we must ask, who gets punished for surviving? Who pays the price for being born poor? Because behind every child who stole a crust of bread was a home with no food. Behind every pocket of stolen coal was a fireless hearth. And behind every cold prison wall was a heart that only wanted warmth. Poor girls were put into service at age 12. Imagine being 12 years old, leaving your home with nothing but a worn dress, a pair of cracked shoes, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, you'd be treated kindly. You're not going to school. You're not visiting relatives. You're being sent into service, to work, to scrub, to be silent. For countless poor girls in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, this wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. Born into poverty, they were dispatched to the homes of the wealthy, often never to return. Their childhoods ended not with age, but with orders. At an age when most modern children are still learning multiplication tables or reading storybooks, these girls were rising before dawn, lighting fires, drawing water, polishing silver, and scrubbing floors until their knuckles split. They were called maids of all work, and the title was no exaggeration. They cooked, cleaned, carried coal, emptied chamber pots, and washed mountains of laundry, often without so much as a thank you. They were expected to be invisible, silent, obedient, to move like shadows. If they were noticed, it was almost always because something was wrong, a wrinkle in the sheets, a missed speck of dust, a floor that wasn't shining enough. Discipline was swift and dehumanizing. A forgotten task or a cracked plate could mean slaps, beatings, or being sent to bed without food. Some were locked in cellars or made to stand outside for hours. Crying was weakness. Defiance was rebellion. And rebellion was crushed. Most were trapped by circumstance. No education, no family support, and no legal protections. A girl in service could be dismissed without cause, and dismissal often meant homelessness. A single mistake could stain a reputation, and in this brutal class system, reputation was everything. A difficult maid might be blacklisted. Whispers spread fast among the upper classes, and without references, no girl could find another position. So they endured. They swallowed their pain. They scrubbed harder, spoke softer, and prayed they'd make it through another day without punishment. The labor was relentless, floors scrubbed on hands and knees, stoves blackened with soot, sheets laundered by hand. Each task had to be repeated, day after day, without error or fatigue. Many worked 16 to 18 hours a day, with only short, silent meals in dim servant quarters. There were no weekends, no holidays, just the rhythm of someone else's bell. Some girls were barely 10. Others lied about their age just to be accepted into service and avoid the poorhouse. Wages were meager, and often paid directly to their parents. Many worked for years without ever touching their own money. Some weren't paid at all, told that room and board was compensation enough. Their voices didn't matter. Their thoughts weren't welcomed. They weren't permitted to speak freely, to laugh too loudly, or to meet the eyes of their employers. Even joy was a risk. And behind closed doors, there were deeper dangers. Many of these young girls were subjected to sexual harassment or abuse by older male servants, visiting guests, or even the heads of the households. Their complaints, if voiced, were often dismissed. Blame was shifted onto them. If they became pregnant, they were fired, shamed, and sometimes forced into asylums or prostitution. Some were even accused of seduction. Their futures destroyed by the silence of a society that valued propriety over protection. Yet, despite all of this, these girls kept the grand households functioning. They polished the brass, lit the fires, warmed the beds, and raised the children of the very people who considered them beneath notice. They carried the weight of wealth on their backs, yet were never permitted to step into its light. Their labor was hidden beneath the illusion of refinement, their suffering erased by polished banisters and gleaming chandeliers. Sometimes kindness broke through. A gentle mistress, a steady household, a rare employer who offered a second pair of boots or a full meal. But these moments were exceptions, not the norm. For most, service was not a step toward opportunity. It was a lifelong role. Some entered at 12 and left only when their bodies failed. The fight for change came slowly. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, social reformers and campaigners began to expose the hidden lives of domestic servants. Books and exposés documented their exhaustion, abuse, and invisibility. Figures like Florence Nightingale and Octavia Hill pushed for greater respect and legal rights. Laws began to emerge, limits on work hours, rights to wages, protections for young girls, but enforcement was weak, and resistance from the wealthy was fierce. For them, servants were not workers, they were background. Even into the 1940s and 50s, particularly in rural Britain and parts of Europe, poor girls were still being sent into service as charity cases or under the label of apprenticeship. The titles changed, the abuse did not. Generations of girls vanished into kitchens, laundry rooms, and attic servant quarters, their dreams reduced to survival. Today, when we visit historic mansions or watch period dramas with their elegant staircases and gloved elegance, we rarely think of the girls who cleaned those steps, the ones who knew the echo of every bell, the weight of every silence, the bite of every insult. But real history isn't just in portraits or parlors. It's in the scalded hands that served tea and the bare feet that cleaned the floors. Because history isn't only about those who ruled, built, and inherited. It's about those who were made to serve and never allowed to speak. And the more we remember their stories, the more human our history becomes. Many babies died in baby farms from neglect. They were called baby farms. The name alone hides the horror. A gentle phrase, almost pastoral, conjuring images of comfort, lullabies, rocking cradles, and sunlit rooms. But the truth behind these places was anything but tender. In the shadows of Victorian cities, in the corners of rural towns, behind locked doors and shuttered windows, thousands of infants were quietly dying. And no one wanted to see. The idea was simple, too simple. Working-class mothers, especially unmarried women, often had no means to raise a child. With poverty choking every option, they turned to advertisements in newspapers or flyers on street corners. Kind woman seeks infant to nurse, loving home, guaranteed. For a few shillings a week or sometimes a one-time lump sum, these strangers promised to care for a mother's baby. They promised safety. They promised affection. What they delivered was often death. The farms were not real farms. They were back rooms, tenement basements, cold attics, rooms overcrowded with cribs, if there were cribs at all. Dozens of infants left in silence, bundled in rags, their cries ignored or muffled behind thin walls. There were no regulations, no inspections, no oversight. The moment a mother handed over her child, that child disappeared into the system, if it could even be called one. Some caregivers tried, but many saw an opportunity. If you took in 10 babies but only fed 5, your profits doubled. If a baby cried too often, you sedated it with laudanum, a liquid opiate that silenced hunger, pain, and often life itself. If the money stopped coming, the infant did too. Starved, neglected, left to die quietly in a corner where the stench blended in with the rest of the room. And the worst part? It worked. Because society didn't want to ask questions. Unwed mothers were considered shameful. Poor women were judged unfit. When a baby vanished into a farm, it also vanished from scandal. It became someone else's burden. And when that burden died, it died in silence, unmarked, unclaimed, and too often unnoticed. In Britain, Australia, the United States, and beyond, baby farms operated with terrifying efficiency throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some women built entire businesses around it, taking in child after child, collecting fees, and discarding bodies when no longer profitable. The death rate was staggering. In some districts, infant mortality in baby farms reached 80 to 90%. But official numbers were rare because no one wanted to count. The most infamous case was that of Amelia Dyer, a trained nurse in Victorian England who turned baby farming into serial murder. Over decades, she is believed to have killed hundreds of infants, strangling them with white tape and dumping them in rivers, all while advertising herself as a loving caregiver. She was eventually caught and hanged, but not before thousands of women unknowingly entrusted her with their children, believing they were saving them from poverty. Dyer was the extreme, but she wasn't an outlier. Many baby farmers didn't kill outright. They just didn't care. They fed infants watered-down milk or sugared tea. They reused cloth diapers without washing. They let illness spread unchecked. Infants wasted away from malnutrition, their limbs thin, their skin gray, their eyes wide with confusion. They died slowly, quietly, often without even a name. For poor mothers, especially those forced to work as domestic servants or in factories, the baby farm was the only option. Employers refused to hire women with children. Orphanages were full. State aid didn't exist. The choice wasn't between good and bad. It was between desperate and unthinkable. So they paid what little they had and prayed it would be enough. Some mothers returned weeks or months later asking to visit their baby, only to be told the child had fallen ill and died. They were handed a vague explanation, maybe a fake grave location, maybe nothing at all. Grief mixed with guilt. But few dared question it. Their shame was used against them, their poverty weaponized. Who would believe a poor, unwed woman over a respectable caregiver? Eventually, public outrage grew. Whispers turned to articles. Coroners began noticing patterns: too many infants from the same address, too many death certificates with the same vague causes: failure to thrive, consumption, natural causes. Slowly, legislation crept forward. Baby farming was criminalized in some regions. Registration was enforced. But it was too late for the thousands already gone. Even as reforms came, many farms simply changed tactics, going underground, rebranding, or operating illegally. And in some parts of the world, they never really disappeared. The commodification of children didn't end, it evolved. Today, we call them illegal adoptions, unregulated care homes, or child trafficking rings. The names change. The grief remains. What makes the history of baby farms so disturbing is that it wasn't just evil, it was apathy. It was an entire system looking the other way, while the most vulnerable human beings suffered. Infants, helpless, voiceless, were reduced to line items, to transactions, their lives weighed in currency, their deaths excused as inevitabilities. We remember them now not as statistics, but as warnings. Every tiny shoe, every scrap of blanket, every fading photo from that era tells us something: that society is judged not by how it treats its strongest, but by how it protects its weakest. And when we fail to listen to the smallest cries, we build systems where silence becomes a grave. Let us never again build homes for profit and call them care. Let us never again turn away because the suffering is too small to hear. And let us never forget that behind every euphemism, every farm, every shelter, every solution, there might be a child no one's looking for, quietly fading, waiting to be seen. Street children vanished without a trace. Imagine a child disappearing into the fog and no one noticing. No name called out, no posters hung, no police alert, just a missing space where a child once was. In the slums of 19th century London, this wasn't rare. It was expected. Every alley, every crumbling tenement, every shadowed corner held a story of a child who vanished. Without warning, without trace, without anyone asking why. Street children were not just poor. They were invisible. And in the harsh machinery of industrial life, invisibility was a death sentence. By the mid-1800s, London streets were overflowing with children who had no homes, no guardians, no protection. Estimates suggest tens of thousands lived and died on the margins, orphans, runaways, and abandoned boys and girls who scraped together a living by selling matches, shining shoes, picking pockets, or simply begging for bread. They slept beneath bridges, in alleyways, inside abandoned carts, or curled against warm chimneys. They were called street Arabs, gutter snipes, waifs, and city sparrows. Romantic names for a brutal existence. And when one went missing, there was no alarm, no search party. The city barely noticed. Some were lost to illness, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, all swept through the slums with terrifying speed. A single cough in a shared cellar could end a dozen lives. Others were taken by the criminal underworld, used as bait, as thieves, or in cases too dark to fully document. Some were abducted. Some fell into the Thames. Others vanished down alleys from which they never returned. What's chilling is not only how often it happened, but how normal it became. A child could disappear, and the world moved on. Without birth records, family connections, or property, their absence left no legal mark. When small bodies were found in the river or in side streets, they were often listed as unknown boy, unknown girl. The files were closed. The graves were unmarked. Even in death, their names were erased. Victorian society was undergoing massive upheaval, industrialization, urban sprawl, mass migration. And yet, amid all that change, few systems existed to protect the most vulnerable. The police were understaffed and overburdened. Orphanages couldn't handle the numbers. Workhouses turned many away. Even well-meaning charities were overwhelmed. It was not that every adult was cruel, but that the structure of society itself made it easy to ignore the missing, so long as they were poor. Some children were swept up by philanthropic programs. Dr. Barnardo famously opened homes to shelter London's lost children, photographing them before and after their transformation into clean, clothed young boys. But even these saviors couldn't reach all. For every child rescued, dozens more fell through the cracks. Some were shipped off to Canada, Australia, or New Zealand in hopes of starting new lives. But for many, those ships were silent vessels of trauma, sending children into lives of isolation and hard labor far from any family. Then there were the rumors. Stories of children sold to illegal anatomy schools, of brothels that targeted young girls, of wealthy men who took in boys as servants and never returned them. Some rumors were likely exaggerated. But in a city as dark and uncontrolled as Victorian London, many whispers held truth. The combination of poverty, secrecy, and social neglect created a vacuum where predators thrived. Street children formed their own underground world. They developed codes, alliances, rivalries. They knew which churches gave bread and which beat them. They knew which constables to run from and which gutters to hide in. But even the most clever couldn't always outrun what waited in the dark. And when they vanished, only their friends, often children themselves, remembered their names. This wasn't just a London problem. It happened in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, in Glasgow, Dublin, and Edinburgh. Every booming industrial city had its lost. Children vanished faster than the systems could record them. And because no one wanted to admit how widespread it was, the silence became policy. The system protected property, not people. And the poorest were never counted among either. Today, we might read statistics about homelessness or child mortality and think we understand the past. But numbers don't bleed. They don't tell you what it felt like to watch your friend vanish and know no one would come looking. They don't describe the guilt of the children who survived, who kept moving, kept hiding, because they knew what it meant to stop, to be noticed, to be taken. When we speak of Victorian progress, of steam engines, global trade, and electric lamps, we must also speak of this, of the forgotten, the lost, the children who disappeared because no one valued them enough to keep them safe. Their names may be gone, but their silence remains. And if we listen closely, we might hear it in the echo of today's missing, in the shadows of modern cities where children still vanish, and the world still turns away. They didn't disappear by magic. They disappeared because they were never truly seen. And until we choose to remember them, truly remember, we risk repeating their fate in a new age under new names with the same old silence. Children were sent down coal mines at age 5. Imagine you're 5 years old, not in school, not in a playground, not at home. You're underground. The ceiling is so low you can't stand. The air is so thick with coal dust that every breath feels like swallowing ash. You're not playing with friends. You're pushing a heavy cart of coal in a pitch-black tunnel so narrow even an adult couldn't fit. This wasn't a nightmare. This was the daily life of thousands of children during the height of the Industrial Revolution. From the late 1700s through much of the 1800s, coal powered everything: homes, trains, ships, factories. It was the black gold of empire. And to feed that insatiable hunger, Britain and many other nations turned to its poorest and smallest: children. In mining towns across England, Scotland, and Wales, children as young as 5 were sent into the mines. Why? Because their small bodies could fit into the tightest seams and narrowest tunnels, places too dangerous or simply too cramped for grown men. Their lives were seen as tools, cheap, disposable, and silent. Children took on roles with names that sound almost quaint: trappers, hurriers, thrusters. But these were brutal jobs. A trapper was perhaps the loneliest. Their duty was to sit alone in total darkness for up to 12 hours, opening and closing wooden ventilation doors to let coal carts pass through. No light, no company, just silence, interrupted by distant creaks, dripping water, and the occasional rat. Imagine the psychological toll: hours in utter blackness with the earth groaning around you. Hurriers and thrusters had it no better. Hurriers were usually children between 6 and 12 who dragged loaded coal wagons through the shafts, often on hands and knees, guided by a rope tied around their waist. Thrusters, sometimes even smaller children, pushed from behind. No shoes, no helmets, often no shirts. The tunnels were wet, slippery, and freezing in winter. Their backs bent, their knees raw, and their lungs filled with coal dust before they even knew how to read. The pay was pitiful. Children earned pennies. But for desperate families, every coin mattered. Entire mining communities were built around survival. Education was a luxury. Childhood was expendable. And mine owners, wealthy men profiting from this suffering, turned a blind eye to the abuse, arguing that children were happy to help. In truth, they had no choice. Injuries were constant: broken bones, crushed fingers, lungs blackened by coal dust. But the most terrifying were the collapses. Tunnels caved in with little warning. Support beams cracked. Gas pockets exploded. In 1838, in the Yorkshire village of Silkstone, 26 children died in what became one of the most tragic coal disasters of the century. A storm flooded the Huskar pit. Children trying to escape through a ventilation shaft drowned together. 11 girls, 15 boys. The youngest was just 7. The news horrified the country. This horror could not be ignored. The public was shocked. Queen Victoria herself demanded answers. In the aftermath, the Children's Employment Commission was formed, and for the first time, testimonies were collected directly from the children. Their words were raw, unfiltered, haunting. An 8-year-old boy testified that he worked from 4 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. A young girl described how she dragged carts through water so deep her hair froze to the mine walls in winter. One said he hadn't seen daylight in a year. In 1842, the Mines and Collieries Act was passed, banning women and children under 10 from working underground. It was a start. But enforcement was weak, and poverty was stronger than law. Children continued to work in secret, slipping back into the dark. Some mine owners simply lied. Others bribed inspectors. And many families, faced with starvation, had no other options. Even those who survived often didn't escape. Their bodies were stunted, their spines twisted, their lungs permanently damaged. They never learned to write. Many died in their 20s. And the trauma? Unspoken. Passed down like the coal dust that clung to skin, clothes, and bone. It wasn't just Britain. In parts of Europe, in the United States, and beyond, child labor in mines was widespread. In Pennsylvania, breaker boys, some as young as 7, sat on conveyor belts for hours, picking sharp slate from coal. Their fingers bled. Some were pulled into machines. These children, too, worked not for ambition, but for survival. We often romanticize the past. The idea of hard work building character. But what kind of world builds character through pain before a child's teeth have fully grown in? What kind of economy requires a 5-year-old to crawl through a tunnel not much taller than their body, just to keep the lights on upstairs? This history isn't just dark. It's buried. Like the children themselves, it's been hidden beneath the foundations of industrial progress. But dig deep enough, and you'll find it. The whisper of small voices calling from beneath the earth, telling us not to forget. And we must not, because while we've come far, echoes remain. Even today, in parts of the world, children still mine minerals used in our phones, our cars, our batteries. The locations have changed. The tools have changed. But the core remains. A child's life weighed against profit, and profit winning. So when we speak of progress, of industrial greatness, we must also speak of the cost, the bones beneath the floor, the hands that bled to power machines. The children who never got to be children. And we must remember that behind every empire built on coal were tiny backs that bent too soon, lungs that filled too fast, and eyes that saw too much darkness too early. No 5-year-old should ever have to wonder whether the roof above them will collapse before dinner. No child should have to wake up dreading another day beneath the earth. That, too, is part of history, and it must never be allowed to repeat.